I thought about introducing you guys, but I think it'd be better if you two kind of maybe talk about how, like, why you're together right now, what you do in forms of teaching digital marketing, and where you do that at, and I think that'd be beneficial. And so we'll just roll right into that. I think you have your slide deck already pulled up, so that should be ready to rock and roll. And so we'll just turn the time over to the both of you.
All right. Thank you, Trevor. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is an exciting webinar for us because we're together, right? So that's a little bit different. I do have a podcast and a video series, but it's just me in front of the camera. So we spent some time setting this up, and hopefully you can hear us and see us, and everything will go smoothly. But since our topic is teaching blended marketing courses, digital marketing in particular, with a practitioner, it only made sense to have a practitioner here with me. So Eric's sitting next to me. To give you a little bit of background about me, I'm an assistant professor of marketing at University of Houston downtown, and our MBA program is very reality focused. So in our program, we actually have professors in the or practitioners in the classroom every night with the professor, which is a really cool setup. And because of all the cool things that Eric and I have been able to do, we wanted to kind of share that with a broader audience of professors. In the MBA program, I teach integrated marketing communications, and it's a very updated current version of that course. So it's very social media focused, very AI focused. And that's why it's really cool to have Eric, who's working every day in these fields, with me in the classroom. I also teach marketing management, and I teach a bunch of classes at the undergraduate level, including digital marketing, buyer behavior, personal selling, and so on. Now, with social media, I do have research in social media, and I've built some video automation tools for various entities who are active on social media, but it's just not something that I'm keeping up with day to day, which is why I'm now happy to introduce Eric, who brings his vast digital experience to the table.
Well, happy Friday, everyone. As you can see in the slide, my name is Eric Saninocencio. So I've been working in digital and social media for almost a decade, actually over a decade now. I've worked at the Southeastern Conference. I was formerly with the Houston Texans here in Houston. And what I try to do is provide real world experience through some of those examples of things that I've gone through. So we kind of have a great combination of blending Scott's wonderful background in research and the case study, then with real world examples that the students can get a lot out of and feel like they can participate in because it's very familiar to them. So that's kind of how our partnership started. I don't know if you wanted to talk through how we met.
Yeah, so Eric and I actually have a history together. We met back in 2012 when I was a PhD student at Texas A&M, and Texas A&M had just joined the Southeastern Conference for sports, and Eric was the digital media manager for the SEC. So that's how we met. And then he moved to the Houston Texans, and then I moved to Rice University, where I was teaching in the MBA program there. So I brought Eric in as a guest speaker. And what was really cool was that the reviews for Eric were so good that even after my postdoc at Rice was over, other professors had Eric coming in as a guest speaker. And now he's my, what we call corporate fellows, which is the practitioner in the classroom with me for the entire MBA term. So to give you a little bit more context about how we do blended learning at UHD, we have 8 face-to-face sessions. Our current IMC class, we have 2-hour and 45-minute sessions. Right. And those 8 sessions are supplemented by online content. And we have a flipped classroom. So all of the lecturing is done online. So we get all of that out of the way so that we don't have to use any face-to-face time mired in lecture. And we can jump in right away to what Eric knows, to discussing case topics. And it's a really fun and dynamic classroom. Now, if your university is not set up for blended learning, I still believe strongly that you're going to be able to apply these concepts. If you do an online only course, if you do a face-to-face only course, I've taught both styles at Rice and UHD, you can still use the concepts that we're going to talk about today. And this is all about just connecting with practitioners, how to kind of share the stage in the classroom, and how we work back and forth to bounce ideas off each other and just ultimately make the experience more enriching for the students.
No, I couldn't agree more. And there's some great stats that you're going to show here. And to his point, like, I think the value that I can provide, or somebody like me can provide in this space, is just being able to tie in what a case study is and what a case study is trying to execute and teach into a real world scenario. And I think we've done a good job, and we'll talk about that in upcoming slides.
Absolutely. Awesome. So kind of the theme for what we're doing for bringing the practitioner into the classroom, not only bringing them in, but bringing them in every night. It's kind of rooted in this idea that theory is not enough. And this is really embedded in our MBA program at University of Houston downtown when the MBA program really expanded a lot over the last 5 years. We currently have over 1,100 active MBA students. So this is a huge program. And the administration, the dean, really wanted the program to be driven by industry. So we went out to industry leaders. Well, I didn't personally, but before my time, they went out to industry leaders and asked them, what should the MBA students know when they're entering the workforce? And they actually crafted all of the learning objectives for every course around that practitioner feedback, that marketing leader, marketing manager feedback, which is fantastic. So they talked to Coca-Cola and Bank of America, Centerpoint Energy, all of these local industry leaders, and came up with learning objectives. And then to make that really hit home, they came up with the corporate fellow model, where we have the practitioner working side by side, team teaching with the faculty member every night. So it's very embedded in our program. Not only is theory not enough, theory is not enough in digital in particular.
No, and I think it's a great point. You know, we talk about cases that are maybe 5 or 6 years old, and in a digital space, that can be night and day from what you're trying to accomplish in that. So I think what we're trying to do, especially in digital, is find some of these cases, but then that's where I can come in and give some real world examples of things I've worked on 3 months ago, 6 months ago, that have relevancy in the moment, right, and allow the students to learn how robust these digital campaigns can be and what different platforms they can use. And we also go back and kind of reanalyze what we would have done had we been in the same situation. And there's some examples of that we're going to discuss in future slides as well.
Right. And I use a lot of Harvard business cases to prepare students to have a classroom discussion. And I taught Harvard business cases at Rice too, without the corporate fellow in the classroom. And the depth of discussion and the relevance of discussion is so much different with Eric in the classroom, because as he mentioned, some of the cases are a little bit outdated. So we can pick them apart and see what's real, like what's strategic and is going to be enduring over time, and what is tactical and changes every year or every month or every 3 days, right, in the digital space. So it provides this really cool dynamic that students really have fallen in love with, as evidenced by this slide. So I think this is a really cool statistic. Last year, 90% of our MBA students said that our corporate fellow, the faculty practitioner partnership, either met or surpassed their expectations. And 90% is a big number. So if I had 90% of students on my faculty evaluation say that they liked me and that they thought I was an effective teacher, that would be fantastic for me, right? So the corporate fellows are blowing me out of the water in terms of the student evaluation. So I think that, this is 376 respondents. So we have a pretty good sample of our students here, like this program. Another thing that's so cool is the first day of class, especially when I teach MBA classes, we always go through and first we'll collect the student goals for the class and try to make sure that we're teaching to those goals in some way. At least, some of the goals are they want to get an A in the class, but the goals that are relevant to their future career. But I also ask them to do a SWOT analysis for the MBA program, just as kind of a first day icebreaker, fun activity. And corporate fellow, the practitioner in the classroom, is always the first thing that they mention. So I think that's worth noting. It's something that I think there can be reluctance to moving into a model like this or incorporating it in your class if you don't have the university structure set up. But the payoff is really tremendous for me as a faculty member and for students. And Eric, you've said that it's also pretty valuable for you.
Yeah, I think, for somebody like me that's not classically trained and didn't go, because social media wasn't something I could study. I graduated in 2003. It didn't exist. So I think for me, I've gotten a lot of positive understanding of what you're trying to teach. And some of the basics even cross over. When I'm doing my parts of the lecture, you'd be like, hey, we can actually tie that into something specific that we were teaching earlier. So I think it's great on both sides because it gives you an idea as a practitioner, what is it the students find valuable and what are they learning? So that way, when you're looking to hire people, you can have a better understanding of what their skill set may be.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's so fantastic. And we're really excited to tell you more about it. So let's jump into kind of how this all works. And I'll tell you about some of the game planning that I do as the faculty member. Then Eric will talk about some of the game planning that he does as the practitioner. And then we'll bring it all together and talk about how we team teach. All right. So first, let's lay some groundwork for it. There's a lot of prep for doing this. So Eric and I actually have an advantage because we had that pre-existing relationship, and he's been a guest speaker for me in other classes. But I've also taught under this model where I met the corporate fellow for the first time 2 weeks before the class started. So in terms of how intensive the preparation can be, it's certainly higher if you are not comfortable with the practitioner that's in the classroom with you. But some of the work that you're doing to prep for the class is like the traditional model. So I will go through and I'll set up a syllabus, and I'll kind of set up a rough script for how these lessons are going to go. And this is at the course level. And then each week, like 2 weeks before a class, I'll kind of script the class, right? And it's not a final script by any means because I'm going to need feedback from Eric. But one thing in the scripting process that's been so cool about working with Eric and other practitioners is that it really motivates me to stay current and relevant in my classroom scripting. So if I'm teaching a Harvard business case from, 2005, I know that's not going to be very impressive to Eric and probably not that impressive to the students. So I work really hard to figure out, how can we update this? How can we make it relevant? How can we draw comparisons between what this company was dealing with back then and what modern companies are dealing with today? So it's a very motivating factor for me as a faculty member. And also in scripting, I tried to choose Harvard business cases that played on Eric's strengths. So we've done cases on social media. We've done cases on AI. We're doing cases across different types of industries. So it's really made me a more creative professor and honestly a more effective professor, keeping practice in mind, keeping industry in mind. So I kind of avoid that complacency that we can get as professors. Like, I'm really good at teaching this case, so I'm going to teach it every year, no matter how dated it gets, how old it gets. I've kind of snapped out of that thinking, and now I'm trying to challenge myself to find things that are more contemporary, right? So that's the scripting process. Also, using student inputs to kind of drive the discussion with the practitioner and involve them. We can use case questions, discussion boards. I get a lot of emails from students that kind of give us talking points to throw to Eric during the class, which can be really effective. And that creates this kind of 360-degree involvement where students are helping build these classes by posting questions in advance, which also can be really effective.
And I think so too. Like, if you're meeting somebody for the first time or as you get to know them, the more that you can understand what their strengths are, I think it only benefits in the greater kind of perspective of what you're doing. So for me, for instance, we talked about some cases using Sephora, things like that,
right,
where it was actually a couple of years old, but we were able to then update them on what the social media sphere is. And I was really able to dive in. You guys can tell we're passionate about this. It's what we do. And I think that energy level, which you'll talk about a little bit later too, carries over to the students because they see how engaged we are with what we're doing. And I give Scott a lot of credit, for trying to find cases that he thinks can match up. And then we talk ahead of time. And then that's where the ideas flow, right? Like, there's things where you script and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a minute, but we're actually doing this, or I was doing this at my previous job. This is something that I can expand on and really give them some real world experience. So I think the more that you can talk through what the strengths are and understanding how they feel comfortable presenting, both of you do, right, it only makes the class better. And I think we've really hit our stride the past couple of weeks because we've really found that comfortable level of, okay, Eric, this is what you're great at, this is what I'm great at. And before you know it, the working partnership just makes everything. I think the students really engage with it better.
Right. And as Eric just alluded to, we're in the thick of this right now. Right. So we just finished last night our 7th out of 8 classes for the IMC course. And it is like you said, it just every class kind of builds on the last one. And I think we've become more effective teaching in this model as we've gone on and as the students become more familiar with how we work together. So the last part of my game planning is working with you to kind of accommodate your interests and your strengths. And that really happens through a walkthrough. So just like a football team will do a walkthrough before they go play a game, we'll do a walkthrough. And then I'm very willing to adapt. And this took me some time. It was probably harder for me my first semester working with a corporate fellow than it is now, but just being willing to kind of let some things go that I was originally planning to talk about so that we can involve Eric more with his real world examples in the class is a big part of this process. And because we know each other so well, that can happen 3 days before the class, that walkthrough, and we can still be really strong in that. I think if you're just getting to know the practitioner for the first time, you may want more lead time than that.
Definitely.
So now I'll throw it back to Eric to kind of walk through how he game plans for our classes.
So this is the first time I've ever been a corporate fellow or taught. Like, I've given speeches and keynotes, but this was a really new and fun and engaging experience just to understand how this process works. So I think I went into it with that mentality. As I mentioned, I'm not really classically trained in integrated marketing. Like, it's something I picked up over the course of my career because it's how my job and profession expanded. So I think I've gotten a lot of benefit just at learning from a core level what you're teaching, how these different concepts lay on top of each other. So I've really enjoyed that part because I feel like I've learned just as much as I've shared. And so whenever we go through that walkthrough process that Scott is mentioning, to me, it's always key to try to drive the conversation to something that I can provide a real world example to. So as he mentioned AI earlier, when I was working with the Houston Texans, we actually had an AI chatbot. So it was an easy transition to talk about what AI means and the benefits of it within the case study in HubSpot. But then also me in the second half of the class take over and talk about how we used it at the Texans and how we used it and the strategies behind it and why they work differently. And I think it was cool because you can have the theory, as you mentioned earlier, of what a chatbot is supposed to accomplish, but I can actually go in to that chatbot, type in questions, and we had the class soliciting questions to figure out how it was routing them. And then I could provide, what we were thinking from an organizational analysis standpoint of why we were doing it that way. And to Scott's point, like, we knew each other, so we definitely had a huge benefit. But we also, as you can tell, we like to talk a little bit. So I think, it took us a class or two to figure out where we felt comfortable. Okay, Scott's going to lead this section, but Eric, feel free to jump in. Eric, when you lead, I'm actually going to be able to tie that into some of the theories that we were talking about earlier. So that takes time, right? And I think that's something, I give him a lot of credit for understanding the process and wanting me to succeed. Because in the end, if I feel comfortable, he feels comfortable, the students are going to see that. It's going to resonate. It's going to make the class and the structure better.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And that really leads us into the next slide, which is how we share the spotlight. And I think there can be a lot of reluctance on the faculty member side to kind of give up what they're used to doing. There's probably more acceptance in the audience that's watching this webinar now because they're teaching digital marketing and they probably better understand the value of bringing in someone from practice. But if you're someone who's been teaching for 10 years or more than 10 years, it's going to be really difficult to go from, if you're teaching a 1 hour, 45-minute class, now all of a sudden you're on stage for 45 minutes or for 30 minutes or maybe an hour some nights. That can be a difficult adjustment. But I think, like Eric said about hitting our stride, once you get through 2 or 3 sessions, the value is just very obvious. Yeah, and sure. I mentioned we do the flipped classroom. So there's really no lecturing that happens. It's all discussion. It's all application in the classroom. And you might not have that model. So for you, if you're teaching 16 classes, it might make more sense to alternate. So you might have a lecture one night, you have the practitioner the next night, and they kind of come every other class. It might not be possible to get the same practitioner in every night. So you might set it up as more of a guest speaking series. Or if you're teaching online only, one thing that I've done is I've created an interview series. So on week 1 of the class, they may watch an interview with Eric and me. Week 2, they might watch me with someone else who works in sales. Week 3, they might watch a video of me talking to someone who works in pricing, right? So you can have this really dynamic environment that's not you standing in front of a gray wall lecturing online, which nobody's going to watch and nobody's going to enjoy. And if they do watch it, it's just because they want to score well on the test. So this is all about how you make your class interesting to students, how you keep them wanting to come back for more. And then the tests and the grades become secondary. I mean, they're excited, and most of our students are currently working. So they're taking things that Eric's teaching them back to work every day. It's like its immediate impact is something that I don't think I'd be able to give students on my own, teaching from the theory perspective. But then like Eric kind of gives them these aha moments, like, oh, now I see how theory fits with something I can really do with my CRM at work, which is really cool.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple examples. We mentioned the Sephora case already, but I think it's really the prime of us putting everything together. So Scott, working hard, trying to find a case that was relevant, went out of his comfort zone a little bit and actually went out to Sephora, took some pictures of things that they were doing in digital because we had a case that was a couple of years old.
It was a decade old. Yeah, exactly. It was a 2009 case.
So you take that 2009 case that was trying to focus on what was then, the very beginnings of social media and how to use it as a complete content strategy. And so we're able to update that for 10 years later. So Scott takes the pictures. It makes sense because Sephora is a brand that's relevant now. People are using it. We had a ton of people in the class saying that they were part of this special program and this, that, and the other. So you get that information flowing, you get the conversation going, you get everybody involved. And then from then I'm able to transition that into, okay, what do all these channels that they were looking at back in 2009 look like today? And to be honest, some of them didn't exist. Some of them had changed dramatically. And it allows me to then take, okay, if we were doing this case in 2019, here's how we would break it down. And here's how these different platforms have changed. And sometimes even leave the onus to them. Okay, now I'm giving you this information. This is what Facebook looks like today. This is how Instagram is engaging. These are things that we're seeing on Snapchat and through video. And they'll come up with questions that would then, okay, if I was in that spot, and you're probably going to talk about this a little bit with the app, what are some ways, if I was in 2019 and I was leading the direction for this Sephora company, how would I use these platforms to benefit? And I think that was one of the fun parts of the class.
Yeah, so one of the decision points in the Sephora case is it's basically how should they allocate money in their digital efforts and what should they take money away from in traditional marketing. And the teaching notes for these cases kind of lead you in one direction as a faculty member. And the really nice thing about having Eric there is he can kind of say, hold up, and offer this alternate viewpoint. So in the Sephora case, there's kind of this decision point about, should they put money into building their own app or should they rely on Facebook to kind of push out their content? And while the teaching notes might push you more toward the Facebook angle, Eric was able to chime in with his own experience with launching an app for the Houston Texans. And it was really cool and relevant. And then so many student questions spin off of things like that. They kind of step back and say, oh, cool, this guy's doing this today in the real world. What can he teach me that I can take back to work tomorrow and present to my manager or to my employees? And it's just really a fun environment.
It really is. And it takes discussions in levels that you may not even thought were possible.
Right.
We'll do that game planning, that walkthrough that Scott mentioned earlier. And we will figure out, okay, here's where we think this will go. But then as we're discussing, you have so many different perspectives in there and they're encouraged to participate. And I think that's one of the parts that we need to emphasize a little bit more is that when you do this type of thing and you have somebody that's both practitioner and also on the theory side, it gets every part of your brain stimulated as to what you're trying to learn. You're learning the actual concepts, but you're learning how they work. And I think that just gets the kids more involved. And they're asking a ton of questions. And like I said, we divert into 4 different paths. Sometimes it's like, man, I thought we were only going to spend an hour on that.
Right,
case.
exactly.
And we spend almost 2. And it's really valuable for them because they feel like they're getting engaged with and they're getting some kind of ownership of the process.
Right. And because Eric and I are talking all the time about this class, we bring in examples that they're living today. Like when the Fire Festival became this big phenomenon with a Netflix special and a Hulu special, we brought that in the class and talked about the integrated marketing communication strategy and kind of integrity and ethics. And it just spun off this really cool discussion, even for students who previously weren't familiar with the Fire Festival. I'm not sure that's something I would have been able to pull off on my own. So just having someone to bounce ideas off of is very atypical, right, for a faculty member. But it really does. I mentioned earlier the complacency factor. It totally wipes that out. Even if you repeat a class with a corporate fellow, there's just this kind of pressure almost to perform and to kind of outdo yourselves from the last semester, which creates this really cool environment.
And I think another good example that we're able to capitalize, and timing was of the importance to it, but the Super Bowl happened during our class. So we were able to prep them ahead of time and say, listen, watch all these Super Bowl ads, see what resonates, look at how much value they're providing, how much is it costing. And we're able to talk through that a little bit. Then the Super Bowl happens and we go through and we do a great job. Scott does a great job of interactively asking them, what they like the best, what commercials they like the best, what didn't resonate. Well, if it didn't resonate, did it still provide value because people are talking about it? And that's really relevant today. They're watching on Sunday night, like 100 million other people were. And then on Thursday, we're in the class discussing that. And that's a really cool moment because like you said, a lot of times these things take time to go from theory to practice, but we were able to incorporate real world things that were happening and things of interest to them to all of a sudden jumpstart a conversation where we can go back to some of the core concepts that we need to teach them.
Right. And with Eric's insider information in football, he was able to provide a lot of interesting insights that, I'm learning every time Eric talks in class. So if students are asking about, well, how are these commercials tying back to their strategy on Twitter and Facebook? Eric Eric had a great depth of information that I don't have. And it's really hard to fake that. Even if I spend, the whole off season from my teaching trying to stay current in digital marketing, I will never be able to present the way that Eric can in terms of how can I use this stuff today in a relevant way. And another thing that we can do with the corporate fellow model that's really cool is we can introduce real world projects to the class. So I mentioned I teach another MBA class in marketing management, and this is a core class. So everybody takes this, the accountants, the finance students, the supply chain, everybody's in this class. And my corporate fellow for that class was Cleo Franklin. So he's an executive at Mahindra Tractors, and they had a new product that they were trying to launch during our term. So we assigned the students a project where they were going to come up with a complete marketing campaign for the new Mahindra tractor. And I've done a lot of student projects throughout my brief career as a professor, and the energy, the enthusiasm, the quality of work that they did, knowing that they were going to present to an executive from this company, was just amazing. I mean, they did phenomenal work, and they were getting like professional storyboards done for commercials that they wanted to run and YouTube campaigns. It was just incredible. So even if you don't have this model where you have a practitioner in the classroom every night, maybe it's possible for you to have a practitioner come in one night to introduce a real world project and then bring them back the last night to evaluate that, so that the students can feel like I'm presenting to the board. Even though I'm ultimately responsible for the grade, I take the input from the corporate fellow, from the practitioner, very seriously. And that accounts for my case, probably more than 50% of the grade on these real world projects. So it's just fantastic.
No, and I think it adds a layer of fun to the environment. Like, I think I come in and I'm excited to hear where we might go. And I think, the growth that you see, because everybody understands digital and social is important. Everybody watching this, the students that we teach. So I think for us, we're providing an emphasis of why it's important and using these real world examples that they then can go out. And I think, I don't know, I just saw an enjoyment level,
right?
Like I've been a speaker at a lot of different classes, and you kind of get this, relationship where you're talking and they're just listening and there's not much in terms of what they're getting out of it. But this year I really felt, especially as we've grown in the class,
right,
just in this encourage and excitement. They get to know you and they know what you're strong at. And we almost turn into, we counsel, we're like providing these opportunities for them to go back and then say, listen, this is what we can do here. And that's a really fun thing to be a part of as a corporate fellow.
Yes. And more in this class and in the corporate fellow classes than anything else I've taught in, we're having to rein it in. It's not like we're trying to encourage students, like, please participate in this class. It's like, hold on, guys. We know you're really excited, but we need to kind of rein it in and move on to something else, which I think is a cool position to be in as a professor. So, and the students are bringing their work into the classroom. I think they have a certain perception of me as a faculty member, as a researcher, as someone who's kind of going to teach something that's theory laden. And then they have a perception of Eric. So I think with Eric in the room, they're much more comfortable bringing their work questions into the classroom, and those often apply to everyone, and it really overlaps with what a lot of different students are thinking, and just makes the whole discussion more interesting and robust.
Yeah, and like I said, you never know where it's going. We talked about the United case yesterday, all the different layers of that, and
flight 3411, when they dragged the passenger off the plane,
we could have went for 3 or 4 hours.
Right.
I mean, I've never seen the class that lively, and you have these different perspectives. And we're trying to tie this into what you would be if you're in this situation. How would you handle it? And there's just so much to consume there because of digital, because of how it works, because of all the different platforms, because of word of mouth, all those things that we need to consider. And you can see them almost like getting to different levels of like, oh, okay, now I understand this part, but wait a minute. Juan Pablo over here said one thing, Andy said one thing over here, and you start to see them kind of formulate a process in their mind. And it's something I've really enjoyed being a part of.
Yeah, and for the United case, it was cool because Eric had his own examples of how he's messed up as a digital media director, so he could relate to what kind of the United team was experiencing in the aftermath of that kind of PR crisis that they experienced. So this is our wrap-up slide, and really I hope that we've communicated that having the faculty member and the practitioner in the room together creates this kind of perfect combo. And while I called it perfect on the slide, there are challenges, and I think some of those probably came across in the presentation, and the challenges are exacerbated if you don't know the practitioner. So you'll want to put in some legwork to get to know who you're working with in the classroom. But we really foster this environment of mutual respect, which isn't hard for me, because you bring so much to the classroom that I have tremendous respect for what you bring. But trying to project that to students and manage it in the classroom is very critical to pull this off well. And what we're really focused on is we're putting in a lot of individual contributions to every class. And Eric mentioned he's kind of a student in the class in terms of the way he prepares for it. So we're individually contributing, but then we hope that the overall value is going to be much higher. So this collective outcome is what we have our eyes on. And in our last session next week, we're going to tie everything that we've talked about back to the goals that we collected from students in the first class. And I think they may even be surprised by how well we covered everything that they wanted to learn in the class and more, which is something that I could have maybe forced into the class, but I don't think I could have done it by myself.
And I think too, the one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times when you have a practitioner that maybe, especially in digital, because it's hard to train for this, it's hard to go to school for it because it's so new and it's changing so fast. A lot of the concepts that I've learned over my 15 years plus in the sports industry, they actually are tied into specific marketing concepts that people are teaching. So I'll give you a great example. I was doing my state of social media, as Scott mentioned, during the Sephora case, and I have these 4 questions I always ask when I start a campaign. Who's your audience? What are your goals? All that kind of stuff. And Scott actually jumped in. He goes, you know what? That's just like the 6 M's. And it was a really kind of fun conversation because I'd never heard it presented that way. Right. And then he went back and referenced it, and the students got to see a real world theory and me actually doing it in a way that I didn't even know I was when I was, previously working with the Texans. So
yeah, and the last point about raising the energy level, it might be conscious the first couple of classes, but for us now it's natural. I mean, the energy level is always high in class, and students want more, which is a really amazing thing to experience as a professor. They want more content. I think if we asked them, hey, can we expand this class to 10 sessions? They'd all say yes, or maybe 90%. Right, 90% of them would say yes. So it's an exciting environment to be in, and I'm happy to be a resource for you if you're looking to go into this model or to adapt it to what you're currently doing as a professor. But with that, I think we'll go ahead and throw it to Q&A.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys. That was super enlightening on how you guys tackle that blended class and bringing in a practitioner. We've had a few questions that were along the lines of, like, how do you go about getting a practitioner, as far as what does the university have to pay to bring someone in like Eric? Is it, maybe you guys can just answer that or give us some sort of ballpark of how that kind of initial process begins.
Right. That's actually a good question, because I don't know the exact figure. Do you want to kind of ballpark it? It's public information. We're a public university. Yeah,
it's it's low 4 figures, but again, and maybe a couple $1,000s. I think is probably realistic if you're looking. Like as he mentioned, there's other ways to do it. Like I was a guest speaker at Rice, and that was just, I came on my own time and I did it because I really enjoyed it, and also spoke. So I think it's the comfort level that, the time of the person. Like it works for me to do this in the spring, because obviously when I was with the Texans, the fall is much busier because we're playing a season. So I think you got to factor all that in as you're trying to approach somebody. When is their busy season? And I think there's some flexibility there and the ability, for you to reach out to people.
Right. And just anecdotally for me, all of my corporate fellows have told me the money is not really a factor at all for them. They enjoy teaching. They enjoy getting their knowledge in front of students, getting the content from the class, because you're kind of like, kind of hitching along on this MBA journey with the students at the same time, which is cool. But if it can be hard, right? If there's no financial incentive, it'll be hard to get a practitioner in the classroom 8 times during the semester. So I think if you're not going to offer any financial motivation, it might be cool to do the guest speaker series. So you have a different guest speaker every night for 8 sessions. Obviously, that's going to require some networking and some legwork from you in advance. And actually at ProfCon, I'm going to be talking about this quite a lot to pitch my talk there at ProfCon at Yellowstone, how to kind of build that network of practitioners. I use LinkedIn very heavily. So I met Eric independently of how I usually meet practitioners. And what I will do is I'll meet people on LinkedIn, introduce myself, and then maybe we'll do a podcast together. And that's a really good segue into, hey, are you interested in coming into the classroom? That's how I got involved with Cleo Franklin at Mahindra, which is, to be frank, like over what I thought was over my head in terms of the quality of people that I can bring in. And that's something I've taken a lot of pride in, bringing in people like Cleo and Eric into the classroom, so that even before the students start class, they're impressed by who the corporate fellow is going to be, and that puts you on really good footing.
Awesome. Eric, here's a question directed towards you. In your experience professionally in industry, if you have direct experience with newly graduated students or interns working with you or working with the Texans, what are some of the skills that you see are common that they're lacking as far as on the digital and social front?
That's a really good question. And when I was working with the Texans, the two people that reported to me for digital, one was 25 and one was 22. So I do have a lot of experience in this area. It's a younger person's game for sure. And I think what they lack is the ability to say that they managed a campaign from start to finish. So they may have worked in their athletic department in college because we're working in sports, and they may have run a Twitter account for a volleyball team or a baseball team, but they haven't had the ability to run a campaign from start to finish that includes multiple channels and also the reporting side. That's usually what I find I have to teach them is, okay, how do you report this out? What was our ROI? What's our value? And so what I'm trying to incorporate with this, and we talked a little bit about it during the presentation, is that how these different cases can provide value and how you can use these channels to achieve that. So I think that's probably the biggest lacking area is they understand social, they've done it, but they don't understand how to build it out from start to finish. And then secondarily, I would say sales is something that we've usually got to teach them how to monetize this and how to build content partnerships that make sense. Like they may have the ideas in their head, but they may not know, okay, this is how you lay out the sales plan. You know, this is what it costs. This is what you're charging. And this is how we're then recapping with the partner afterwards to see if they got the value that they were looking for.
And that's the feedback that our university got when they went out to industry to get learning objectives too. So a lack of understanding of what a CRM does and how to use a particular CRM. So we teach in our course, we're using NetSuite to give students projects. I may be transitioning to Salesforce at some point, maybe next spring, but not knowing CRM, not understanding how social ties into sales and into other parts of an integrated marketing campaign. So it's really cool. Our learning objectives are much different than what I'm traditionally used to seeing. They're very focused on those gaps that Eric identified.
Cool. What's your average class size? And the question that came in was, what if my class size is around 20 to 30? And then maybe we can go on the other side of that of, what if we're 50, 75 plus?
Okay. That's a good question for me because I have a massive range of class sizes. The class that Eric and I are teaching right now is 35-ish. So we have about 35 students, which is, it's a concentration class. So we only have the MBA students who are specializing in sales, marketing, and business development. But I also teach the core class in marketing, which I had in the fall 2 sections. One had 65 students. The other had 85. So the classes that I taught with Cleo were these gigantic classes. And I think, there are some differences logistically in terms of, how are you going to involve students in the big classes? I use a lot more polling, and the corporate fellow, the practitioner, helps me put those polls together. So everyone has some input on what's happening. So I'll ask like big questions about a case or big questions about what was happening at Mahindra where Cleo works. And then all the students would respond to the poll. It might be an open-ended word cloud type result, or it might be multiple choice. But then we use that as the springboard to individual discussion, kind of a mix of cold calling and students volunteering answers. But even in a class of 85, we are able to manage a discussion-based section. I think if it got north of that, it might become kind of daunting and you might lose people. But I think that's a sweet spot. 20 to 30 students is a great environment to run class projects. So you can have a real world project with teams of 5. Much harder to pull off. We did group projects with 85 students, but the teams were huge, which created other challenges for us and for the students. So they had 10-member teams that they're working on, but there was a lot more manpower and hours that they could put into the project. So certainly trade-offs, but we're able to pull this model off in classes as small as 15 as a university and classes as large as 85. So 85 would be the tippy top.
Great. Thank you for that perspective. So you guys mentioned a lot about the cases that you covered and kind of how you can adapt on the fly. And if something hot is happening right now, you can kind of bring that in the classroom and talk about something that's really relevant. So do you guys have a list? Like, what if I'm an instructor and I want to kind of replicate this, do you guys keep track of this anywhere? Is there like a downloadable that we can grab from you guys and then at least make it available on the post-conference page that at least has a list of kind of the current cases that you guys have had success using in your class?
Yes, absolutely. I could even rank them, or we could rank them in the order of success, because some of the cases this term we taught for the first time. Right. So, well, it was our first time doing this model together, but they were some of the cases I had taught before, and others were first timers for us, and those were actually the best ones because they were the most contemporary. So I'll kind of take the Harvard course pack and we'll rank the cases, and then we can post that in the post-conference materials. Cool.
That'd be awesome. Thank you. You also mentioned real world projects that you use. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar yet with one of our newest real world projects with SEMrush.
Right.
If I had a link, maybe I'll find a link and I'll drop it in here. But we give your students, your classroom, free access to their Guru plan. You get 30 days worth of that, and that's like their $200 a month plan. And so with that, you get any websites, any digital marketing analytics or metrics about any campaign or website out there, digital or social. You have right at your fingertips. And so I don't know if you guys have used SEMrush before. I don't know.
We haven't, but this is our first time. Let me say though, tools like that are invaluable. They are so awesome for professors because, especially when the classes get a little bit larger. So when you're looking at more than 25 or 30 students, having access to SEMrush or having access to simulations, things like that can kind of bring students together collaboratively to work on real world problems can be super valuable, because the fit of the corporate fellow with the content is not always perfect, right? So Eric has lots of strengths, which is really good for me. But there are some corporate fellows who are going to be really strong in the content for 3 classes, but maybe the other 5 they're a little bit weaker or less experienced in, and then they become more of a color commentator on what you're teaching in the cases. So I think tools like that are incredible. And I'm hoping to teach more digital marketing content at the MBA level moving forward. So everything that Stu Kent offers is going to be really valuable for me.
Great. A longer question just came in. I'll answer that in just a moment. But Eric, maybe if you can touch on this, when you were working with the Texans, you mentioned something about some chatbot marketing, and where we spoke about chatbot and AI marketing a few sessions ago. Maybe you can kind of just share what a company or a business like the Texans, like how do they apply that?
That's a good question. I think for us, this goes back to the pre-planning. It's something that we did heavily at my time there, is that we were trying to use AI to address an issue that we couldn't solve on our own. So for us, the Texans, we were very fortunate. They've sold out every game in the history of the franchise. So moving ticket sales is not something that defines their marketing strategy like a lot of other teams do. So I think for us, we kept getting feedback from our fans. They had a wait list that was almost 30,000 people long. So they're trying to provide information to them for fans that wanted tickets. And so what it caused the pain point for the Texans with is that you had all these conversations where people are like, oh, I want to get season tickets. I want to get season tickets. And we unfortunately had to give them the response, sorry, there's none available. So I think that's kind of where it started. So we used it as a way for them to find out all the different opportunities, either join the wait list, join our fan clubs, understand more about what our single game season tickets were like and club suites and all that stuff. So we wanted to build out some kind of framework there. So we use AI to do that. But then it grew into the opportunity for us to handle guest services within the stadium. We had it integrated into our app. It was called Ask Toro. And so any question that you may have, whether it was about the team, how well we were playing, who our head coach was, how I could order food from my section in the club level of the stadium. We started to build all this out, and it became like a tool that really grew and really had a lot of different valuable entities within it. So it started as a simple problem. How do we automate this ticketing process so that we can get people to places where they can interact with us? And like most AI chatbots do, they grow, they learn, they continue to adapt. And then we started using it as a way for guest services and for people to interact with us with questions. And because we get so much volume of questions, especially on game day, it can be challenging to get a one-to-one connection, especially if they're simple, that we can answer them. We built the chatbot to serve that role. And like I said, in the 2 years that we were using it, it almost completely blossomed from this singular ticket idea to something that could serve as our first point of contact for a lot of people if they had questions about the organization as a whole.
And Toro is the mascot for the Houston Texans. So I think that was kind of a brilliant way to package it, because we always try to figure out how human should these chatbots be. And they didn't really have to worry about it, right? Because it was already attached to this personality. But at the same time, it's a mascot.
And the mascot doesn't talk. So it kind of fit in pretty seamlessly. That's a good point.
Smart. Cool. So let's see if we can wrap this question up in about a minute. Okay. We're right at 10:45, but when doing group projects with multiple teams, do you have each team work on a different area, or they all pitch the same thing? And then is there financial compensation for the professionals? So that's a two-sided question there, which we already addressed that in a couple of questions ago. So let's go back to the first question about the group project.
Okay. That's a really good question, because it's something that I'm currently working on. So in the fall, with the project that I mentioned that we did with Mahindra, they all created a complete marketing campaign. The campaigns were all very different because there are so many options. There were different ways to segment the market, different target markets, different social media platforms that they chose to emphasize or de-emphasize. So we got a lot of variance in the quality of presentations and also in the content. And I kind of took the cream of the crop and then sent the full written reports over to Cleo to evaluate. And he was extremely impressed with that content. But Cleo and I are going to be teaching again in the second term this spring. And we're actually going to now give the students different areas to work on, because we did get a lot of redundancy. So, the night of presentations, we saw the same competitive analysis 10 times, and we saw, the same segmentation activity 10 times and the same SWOT analysis 10 times. So now we are looking to chunk it, and we're trying to figure out how to do that. And I think one key is going to be having, instead of this as a semester long project, see you at the end, we're going to have checkpoints every 2 weeks to kind of figure out where everybody is. And then we can even adapt what we're asking them to do by the end of the semester based on all the inputs we're getting from everyone else. So when you have a really large class, 85 students, I think it can get really redundant to give everyone the same project. But if it's a smaller class, maybe you have 20 students, I think you can make that work, right? And it's not something where by the 10th team presenting, everyone's going to be dozing off.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That's great. Hey, Eric and Scott, thank you guys so much for being on and bringing in your perspective of what you have seen to be successful in teaching a blended classroom with a co-teaching platform. If we have your Twitter handles down here on the left, so feel free to go follow Scott and Eric on Twitter. I'm sure they're on LinkedIn as well. So if you have any questions you want to address outside of this, feel free to go do that, and then we'll provide. Scott, I'll hit you up after this, and we'll get those cases that you just mentioned. We'll make sure that those get available. Those are available to all of the attendees as well. So thank you guys so much.
Fantastic. It was a lot of fun. Thank you, everybody.